Adaptation and Climate Change Office. This is the May edition of our monthly adaptation community meeting. If you don't get our emails, you don't get invited to this via email, there are sign-up sheets outside. You can write your name and email address down, and we will begin to let you know what's coming. Before I get to Britt, who is standing here so close because we're trying to make sure people online can hear. If you can't hear online, let us know. Let's see, next month we have, told me who it was, and I...
Climate Decision.
Oh, Climate Decision, yeah. Peter Cocopelli from Climate Decision, thank you. And July, we're still firming up, so I won't tell you who's going to be here in July because I don't want to get it wrong. And today we have Britt Parker, and then online we have John Marra. And they're going to talk about work they've done for the State Department and USAID in the Pacific Islands, sort of reopening aid work in the Pacific and starting the climate programs out there. And I will turn it over to Britt.
Great. I don't need that. So can everybody hear me in the room? You can. Okay, great. And hopefully online. So I'm actually with NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program, and John is with NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information and is their Regional Climate Services Director for the Pacific Islands. So he's actually the project lead and sits in Honolulu, Hawaii, and couldn't be with us today. So he's here virtually in this very techie corner of the table here. So I worked with John on this project for a couple years, and then the Coral program has actually funded some additional work. But my day job is with the Coral program as their Climate and International Coordinator, and I sit in Silver Spring, Maryland. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about the efforts we've taken over the last few years to enhance global climate change adaptation capacity in the Pacific Islands. And I want to acknowledge the Department of State and U.S. Agency for International Development for their support of this project. And I want to spend a little time talking about some of the challenges that climate variability and change present in the Pacific Islands, the goal of this project and our approach to strengthening adaptation capacity, as well as then dive a bit deeper to our work in Vanuatu specifically, which I think illustrates the process and the framework we've set up through this project. And then talk a little bit about the lessons learned. I'm going to try to be patient. There we go. So as we're all aware, climate vulnerability and change are both being felt significantly in the Pacific Islands. Long-term sea level rise, increasing sea surface temperature, changes in precipitation pattern, coupled with the processes around ENSO events, El Nino, La Nina, are causing higher than normal king tides, more frequent inundation events, coral bleaching, changes in fish availability, drought in the islands, as well as flooding at times. And the headlines say it all. I mean, there's extreme drought right now in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. Chuuk and Palau have declared states of emergency along with a federal disaster declaration in the region. We're currently experiencing the third global mass bleaching event and death across the Pacific of corals. Loss of islands, intense tropical cyclones, and resulting issues with food security. All these are commonplace in the headlines these days. So there's no denying those impacts, and what we tried to think about is how to better support the Pacific Islanders to cope with these changes, and more importantly, to prepare for current and future impacts and minimize the impacts felt by their community members. So NOAA, with support from Department of State and USAID, took on a 2-year project to tackle these issues and try to deliver actionable climate information to the Pacific Islands to inform adaptation planning. And before I dive in, I want to highlight a few of the questions that we kind of struggled with and mulled over as we tried to implement this project. And it may resonate with others in the room who work in this arena. Questions of how you build a process of engagement that's sustainable with partners in the small island developing states. How do you enhance coordination with other donors, entities who work in these regions, because there's so much going on that's related, and how do you not just inundate them with assistance all the time and actually help them to build capacity to use the information they're gathering? What's the right balance between investing in a particular place, nation, versus regional capacity? And what framework, or can a framework for climate services be set up that's flexible in addressing multiple timescales for preparedness and response? So those are some of the things that we kind of struggled with as we worked, to implement the project. So our ultimate goal was to improve the delivery of climate information to the Pacific Islands such that that information was actually incorporated into decision making. And so broadly, this is climate services, or a mechanism to identify, produce, and deliver authoritative and timely actionable information. And the only way to do this in a meaningful way is to engage with the end users and really understand the issues they're dealing with, their current information and decision-making process, and kind of what's missing and how to help shore that up. So our basic approach, there it goes. Nope, sorry. I'll figure out the clicker at the end. So it's showing one thing on my computer. There we go. I'm going to push and stop. Ah, excellent. Just slow down, right? So we were asked to set up a sustained process of engagement around climate information and services around adaptation. And we did this first by tackling the question at the regional scale through a climate services forum, then sub-regionally through additional outreach to refine the ideas from that forum, and then by engaging in a number of countries with in-country dialogues that resulted in the generation of country-specific programs and activities to actually strengthen the climate services in that country. So let's dive deeper into each one of these steps. So the Climate Services Forum was held in January of 2013 and kicked off the project. And the goal was to raise awareness and engage in dialogue about climate services to strengthen and build new relationships between those that produce the information and those that actually use the information. And we also wanted to really understand some of the most critical issues they were dealing with in the region. And when we started planning this meeting, we were thinking that if we had 50 people come, like, we'd be really happy. And we had planned the meeting as kind of small working meetings, breakout groups, a lot of kind of one-on-one interactions and attention between representatives from the countries and also partners who were also engaged in this work, donor agencies in the region. And so thank goodness for our local partners at the University of South Pacific, the U.S. Embassy in Fiji, as well as GIZ presence in the region from Germany, because we ended up running a forum with over 200 participants. They were represented 30 countries, and they included representatives from over 25 institutions, regional organizations, and donors involved in climate services in the Pacific. So at this point, we were pretty sure there was some pretty good interest in the topic as we began to move forward. And so the key recommendations that came out of the forum oh, okay. That's my problem, maybe. There it goes. Okay. So the key recommendations that we took away were to really focus on transformation of data and information to a form that's easily understood and readily accessible. So that also included placing that information into the local context so that it was usable to those on the ground, and aggregating multiple sources of data and information into one place so that, again, it was easily accessible. We also talked a lot about grounding products and services in this iterative co-production of knowledge, if you will. And so that's really about not only the importance of combining like the latest and greatest scientific knowledge and products, but also thinking about the local and traditional knowledge and working side by side with the users of that information such that it was actually useful to them. And finally, there was a need to align and coordinate activities. And you'll hear me say this again and again, but the participants of the forum were like literally begging us to make sure that we were coordinating with Australia, with New Zealand, with Germany, with the regional organizations, again, because there's so much going on, there's so many trainings, so many meetings, and they really, they were interested in the help, and I think one of the biggest wins of that meeting was on the last day we actually brought I think it was 25 different of those partners and the folks working in the region together to try to kind of work plan together and align and build on partnerships that already exist, but make sure that we were speaking together moving forward. The other big one was that there was an understanding that when we started off the project, we were focused on long-term projections and scenarios to inform adaptation planning. But the forum happened to take place just as the current El Nino was developing. And so they also asked that while they understood the importance of that long-term planning and adaptation planning, what they really wanted to focus on was shorter-term seasonal forecasts and outlooks that could inform their climate early warning systems. And so that's what we ended up focusing on and moving away, from that longer-term adaptation focus that we started with. So our approach, based on the outcomes of the forum, we spent some time thinking about what we had heard, working with different partners who were working in the region, and thinking and doing some sub-regional outreach. And through that, we determined that we needed to work certainly in countries, which we were already planning to do. We also honed in on kind of an approach, which was that you needed to bring together teams of people who generated climate information, those that transformed that information, if you will, so those on the ground who understood the local context and could take the science and make it relevant and the products relevant, but also you needed what we called the transmitters. So these are the local people from the community, the church leaders, the elders, a local NGO, a theater group in one case. They were the people that the communities were listening to and talking to and were our trusted agents, in essence, of information. And so the idea was to bring all of those together. And the other thing that we tried hard to do is to always engage with representatives from other entities who were working in the place. And so Australia and New Zealand, SPREP, and the Secretary for the Pacific Communities were some key partners that we worked with on each of these dialogues, but there were others, and so that was also quite important. And the other thing that we did is focus in then on 3 areas or topics that we would take on in these places. So that was preserving freshwater resources and minimizing drought, fostering community resilience to the impacts of sea level rise, coastal inundation, extreme weather, and sustaining marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And so any place in which we began to engage, we would talk with them, see what the problems were, but within these 3 topic areas. So the in-country dialogue process evolved during the project, and of course we felt we finally nailed it at the end. But basically 2 to 3 months of working with local planning team culminated in 3 days on the ground to share and learn from one another. And over the course of 6 months in 2014, we held 5 dialogues in 5 different countries, focusing on 7 different topical areas and involving representatives from an additional 7 countries across the Pacifics. And I'll quickly walk through the process, kind of using, again, Vanuatu as an example, and then we'll dig a little deeper into Vanuatu. So the pre-dialogue exchange, let's see if this will... There we go. So the pre-dialogue technical exchange. So as I said, we spent quite a lot of time identifying local partners to work with. We would always start with the Meteorological Service, as they have the mandate to deliver climate information in these nations. And they helped us to identify not only the issues of focus, but also other key agencies we needed to engage with, whether that be Fisheries Department, a Natural Resource Management Department, Ag, Water Services. So they helped us form our local planning team. And so we would literally work with them in those months leading up to the dialogue to design the dialogue that we would actually, the process in country. This is going to be there we go. Okay, so when we got in country, the first step was sharing of local stories. So this not only helped us identify some of the key issues, but it helped us identify what information the communities currently had access to. And then we would follow this with sharing of experiential knowledge and the latest climate science knowledge on climate-related, on the related issues and impacts. So in Vanuatu, for example, this included a story about work with Australia to put together the Cloud and the SARA toolkit, and I have an example here. And so this is an outreach tool to teach communities about the impacts of El Nino and La Nina so they're better prepared to deal with them. They know what El Nino and La Nina is, they know what to expect. And so one of the stories we heard was about that process and about learning how better to communicate with community members. The second step in the process, then, on the ground, is what we call diagnosing climate services. Oh my goodness. I don't think the keyboard's working either. Sorry, guys. Okay. Stay. I'm going to put it down. We'll talk about both of these steps without touching anything. So the intent was to, in essence, diagnose the current state of climate services in the country. So building on the stories and the experiential knowledge, and we explored current products and decision-making processes with the intent of identifying gaps and things that weren't going well so that we could then strengthen in these areas. In the case of Vanuatu, again, this led to a discussion where they shared that they felt pretty confident in their ability to provide early warning to the agriculture sector. And in fact, they had worked, again, building on the work with Australia and some funds from Germany. They have the ENSO handbook, and it's a really great, really neat tool where for the agriculture sector, they actually break down if you're a pig farmer, if you have beehives, if you know, depending on what crop you're raising, what impact El Nino or La Nina may have on you, and what actions you can take ahead of time so that you're prepared and you minimize the impact to yourself, both from the standpoint of having food to eat and also, you know, your livelihood. And so they felt like they were doing pretty well with climate early warning for the ag sector, but they felt like they really didn't have anything for the marine sector. And so that was one of the things we talked about with them, is updating the climate early warning for the marine sector and then updating the handbook. And then finally, looking back at the process, we built on this information to actually create climate stories or case studies that would help illustrate best practices and encourage both learning in country but also between countries, because these stories were then shared. And we wrapped up with a session to collect and refine the ideas for activities to continue to work with the countries to strengthen their climate services. So I want to just briefly look at the kind of high-level general products that came out of that, and then again we'll come back to Vanuatu. So the first one is the Pacific Island Climate Storybook. And so this is a compilation of technical materials, process guides, and activities that were used to conduct all of these dialogues, as well as build the climate stories. And so it's both a physical product, a book, as well as a website. And in essence, what this allows someone to do is run their own dialogue. And this was important because a lot of the partners recognized that this process could be used to engage with local agencies and stakeholders to improve the flow of information around climate impacts. And in the case of Vanuatu, for instance, they recognized that they needed to actually have better communications between themselves, the Met Service, and the Fisheries Service. And so they actually wanted to run their own dialogue with the Fisheries Service. So this has everything, agendas, process agendas, templates for what you might want to include in different presentations, et cetera. So that's there. And it's important to note, while we focused on early warning and seasonal outlooks, we felt that this same process could be adapted and used for climate adaptation and the longer-term projections and scenarios that were needed to support adaptation. As I said, part of that is the process to develop climate stories, these case studies, and highlight some of the key messages in delivering climate information and services. Again, this is one example from Vanuatu on the Cloud and the SARA project with Australia. So that was one of the stories they told. We also developed, or started the process for developing, I should say, regional impacts and outlook dashboards. So this is one example for the Hawaiian Islands and the U.S. Pacific jurisdictions. So this is the one that was fully fleshed out with additional funding, different sources of funding for the U.S. But the idea is that you gather together predictions, current information, outlooks, alongside recent impacts of weather and climate events in, again, a concise and accessible format. In addition, we worked with Vanuatu to take that a step further, or a step down, if you will, to the national level. And we worked on a proof of concept to take that data and information, think about what thresholds an indicator might hit that would necessitate an action in order to minimize impact of an event, that would then trigger actions that were described in their ENSO handbook. So, we began to look at what that might look like. So dials, so, we'll talk a little bit more about the coral reef example in a few minutes, and that may become a little more clear of this idea of indicators, thresholds, and then actions. We also packaged everything. It's all web-based. I've already spoken about that a little bit with the storybook, but all of this information is online. There's a catalog of all of, or I shouldn't say all, because there's so much going on and new things every day, but a catalog of the outlooks, the projections, and that for the Pacific Islands, as well as all of the information on all of the dialogues and the outcomes that we ran. So I don't expect you to actually read this. But this is really where the project with USAID ended. So we set up the process, we engaged in multiple countries, we identified some short-term actions that we were able to work with them to fulfill, but then the project ended. But we had set up this sustained kind of process of engagement to help them with their climate services. And this is just kind of to illustrate that. This is the whiteboard in my office during this project. And, we see the different steps at the regional, you can't, but trust me, up high there's, kind of what we did at the forum, how that came down sub-regionally. But then there's a series of these different dialogues we had in these different places. And so the key point is that for a place like Vanuatu, which is in purple here on the the far left side, that they identified a set of actions that some of them, like I said, within a month or two of leaving the country, we were able to work with them to complete. So they had 2 climate stories. They wanted to set up a Crown of Thorns task force because they were having a Crown of Thorns outbreak that was affecting the health of their coral reefs. They did that as soon as we left. That task force is still working to address that threat to coral reefs. So there were things that could happen right away, but there were others that needed more time and technical support to achieve. And then just also noting that we had attendees from Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and what they came to is they themselves wanted to engage in one of these dialogues and set up this process within their country. So that begins to kind of give you an indication of how this might work long-term with work planning with a country and setting up a process by which you strengthen the climate services within the country over the course of a few years and then are able to hand it off. So here we go. So diving deeper, so our first dialogue in Vanuatu was in May 2014, and one of the 2 topic areas we focused on was sustaining coral reef ecosystems, specifically because of their importance to them in food security and coastal protection. Because of this focus on coral reefs, the NOAA Coral Reef Conservation Program, where I work, actually funded some follow-up work in Vanuatu. And so we were able to then go back and keep going on that iterative process. We were supposed to do this work in 2015, but Tropical Cyclone Pam hit, and we've had to put it off. So we literally just got back from this exchange on Sunday, late Saturday night. So this is all very fresh and timely, since we were able to incorporate it into the presentation today. So the technical exchange was to start to build that dashboard I showed you earlier, to complete their climate early warning system, to update their ENSO handbook with the actions associated to try to protect or adapt in the marine sector to these impacts, and to build their climate early warning system. And we also then supported the dialogue with the fisheries department that they had said that they wanted. So we're hitting on 3 or 4 major things that they had identified in that first iteration of dialogue 2 years ago. And so we followed the exact process I just laid out for you. So we co-planned over the last 4 months with the Met Service there and the Fisheries Department. We identified key partners. We talked about what they wanted to accomplish. And then we went and did the exchange. So I'll talk for just a minute on what we were able to do over those 4 or 5 days. During the week, I think we really achieved 4 to 5 major outcomes that they were quite happy with. So the first was to update their climate early warning system for the marine sector. And so technical experts from NOAA and the University of Hawaii sat down in this picture, you're looking at it, with their technical staff, and they literally looked at different types of information, remote sensing from the United States, from NOAA, from other countries. They figured out where it was using sea surface temperature as the exemplar indicator that they were interested in. They figured out how to pull the information down to their servers and store it, and how to set up a process by which that's done at an interval of once a week or twice a week. They then sat and coded, wrote the code to take that data and information and put it into a product that was meaningful to them. So in this case, they broke down what NOAA would give them. This is having to do with current coral bleaching stress, sea surface temperature. So we would give them information holistically for the country. What they wanted is to break that down by provinces. So we did that. They pulled down the data, they graphed it, and so I don't have the figure with the gauge, because they actually got the gauge at the last minute on the last day, but in essence, they've produced this product, and they now have a template for how they're then going to go do that for other variables and other sets of information that they want to include in their climate early warning system. And luckily they have the technical staff to do that. They have the web presence to do that. People are used to accessing the information in that way, and they have already in place kind of the mechanisms for disseminating that down to the community level. The second thing that we worked on, so while the tech teams were off coding, we also sat down with the fisheries department, local fishers, local dive tour operators, people who are out on the reefs, who depend on the coral reefs. And we talked about what they're struggling with, what the concerns are, what data we could use as indicators when these problems may occur, what the thresholds might be based on the scientific literature, and help them to, in essence, and what actions they could take to try to minimize damage or impact. And we drafted out what will become the marine sector portion of the ENZO handbook. So they have that. We've already handed that off. And again, this was done sitting beside them and working with them. Next, we drafted a marine sector impacts, a national statement on the impacts of the current El Nino and tropical cyclone Pam on the marine sector, and a climate bulletin and outlook for the fisheries department. So this is an internal communication that will go from the Met Service to the fisheries department in Vanuatu, so that the fisheries department can then disseminate the pertinent information to their stakeholders. And so both of these have corollaries in the agricultural sector, so they wanted to set them up for the marine sector, and we were able to do that. The last thing that we worked on was so in order to help minimize the pressures on coral reefs and coral reef fisheries for food, Vanuatu is lucky in that tuna come very close to shore. And there are current projects funded by the German Development Bank and others to deploy fishing aggregation devices at certain points around the islands to bring those tuna closer so that they're accessible by the community fishers. And that all sounds great, and it is, but there's still issues of safety because the waters of Vanuatu very quickly become treacherous even if you're close to shore. And it's cost a lot of money still to put fuel in the boats and get out to the aggregation devices. And so one of the things that we have drafted is a strategy for them to set up what they're calling the Nearshore Pelagic Fisheries and Safety Bulletin. And so that, again, we talked to tuna experts and other experts working on these projects about what types of information might give indication of prime periods of time where tuna may be closer inshore, so sea surface temperature, ocean productivity, some current information, along with a lot of the things that would affect the safety, their safety going out. And the idea is to start to pull this information into their early warning system. So a strategy to do this. There's a lot that has to be ground truth. The fisheries department, obviously you don't want to just go out and tell fishers, yeah, go now. There's a lot of ground truthing that needs to happen. But because we were able to partner with ongoing projects in the place that are doing this work, hopefully we can have, by working together, gain better outcomes. So we've laid the groundwork for that. So to wrap up, we accomplished a lot in Vanuatu last week. And obviously we're pretty happy with the process we put in place over the 2-year project with USAID. But I think it reiterates a lot of the lessons learned, our work just last week that we had with the larger project. And I think that a lot of these will recall some of the questions that I posed at the very beginning. So first, the co-production of knowledge. So important. I think anytime you're working in a place, different culture, different, just different. You need to understand what's important to them, how they communicate, how they react, what's gonna fly, what's not. And so that co-production results in products that are used and useful, and that's the ultimate goal. And it also, I think, is a really unique way to provide capacity and build capacity. So it was really funny to watch the 2 tech teams working together, because Jim and Scott, who were with our team, would stand back and they wouldn't touch the keyboard, and they're like, we'll help you, but you're coding, you're doing this, And so I think at times there was frustration because they just wanted to get it done, and they're like, no, but we're not going to be here next week, and you're going to be the next variable, the next set of data and information, you're going to have to pull it down. And so just that, and the other thing that was amazing was the smiles on their face at the end of the week when they put up that graph. That was their graph, their figure. They developed that. And so I think it really not only built their confidence, but the division directors within which they sit were like, oh wow, you guys did this. When we presented it back to them at the end of the week. So just that co-production and iterative process is so important. The follow-through and the sustained process. It's been really challenging to engage and set that up and then not be able to follow through. So we've been really lucky in certain places, in the Marshall Islands, in Vanuatu, and a couple other places we have been able to follow through and follow up. There's still a lot of work to be done, and we're going to try to find some funding to go back again in a couple years to Vanuatu and continue along this road and process with them, in part to do that for them, but also because we think it really sets up a nice pilot and an illustration of how this can work. And because there are so many people kind of coming in and in these places, I think you quickly lose face and you lose trust with partners when you're not able to follow through. So that's absolutely, it was something we knew going in. It was confirmed by all of our interactions, and is a lesson learned that I would, that I think is a highlight and something to share with anyone working in these regions. So the capacities of the programs or the countries to implement early warning systems varies greatly. Vanuatu is kind of the gem, I think, in that they've already kind of set up a system, and we're just coming in and trying to help them strengthen it. And so we've taken the first 2 steps with Vanuatu, and I think they'll go a long way with what we've done. There's more we could do. But there are other places where I think the road to the eventual complete handoff is not so clear. The capacity is just not there, or they're like, it's less, or it's almost non-existent. And so we've thought a lot too about how through this process you could set up a framework for climate services in the Pacific region that then could be handed off to a regional organization to implement and to maintain, especially for those countries who can't do it for themselves at this point in time. So Vanuatu, obviously, immediately wanted to make it theirs. They wanted the data, they wanted to put it on their website, and that was great. But there are many places, obviously, that's much harder and a much bigger challenge. But I think we're lucky in the Pacific because we have strong regional organizations, and there's a precedence for handoff of these types of projects to those organizations to carry forward. Finally, barriers. There are many barriers, many different types of barriers. Things happen slowly. Sometimes they don't happen at all. And then all of a sudden things happen. You know, it's like everything we know about implementing projects in a local place and space with local partners. And I think that, you know, I'm using the word barrier. I don't know if that's the right word, challenges maybe. But again, like just the constant inundation of opportunities, you know, for trainings, meetings. I think in Vanuatu they said that over the 6 weeks before we were there, 3 of those weeks they had teams from either all the other countries working in partnership because they were in a meeting, or they had teams from other donor countries or programs. And we left, they had a week off, and then they had another one. And so that's 5 major events in 10 weeks. You know, and so again, like we've tried really hard to coordinate with a lot of those countries, with a lot of those projects and programs. New Zealand and Australia were great. They were at all of our exchanges or dialogues except the last one. We couldn't quite make the timing work. And Australia is handing off a fairly big climate project to SPREP right now, and so there's some transition going on there. But I think it's just really emphasized the need to try to do better at coordinating, and it's hard. It takes time. That alone takes capacity. So, but I think that's one. And then the little things like I remember desperately trying to get an email through to the Met Service Director in Papua New Guinea because he was coming to our meeting and we need to ticket his, airline ticket. And I couldn't get through. And I happened to say something about this when I was on the phone with a partner from the Australia Bureau of Meteorology, and she starts laughing and she's like, oh, good God, their servers are always overwhelmed. You never use their real account. Use their Gmail. Here it is. Sure enough, 24 hours later, I had my answer. 48 hours later, it was ticketed. So it's these little things that, can make life a little bit challenging. And the partnerships, I can't speak highly enough about our partners, and they're too numerous to name, but I'll show them to you maybe. There we go, maybe not. Yep, hope you caught that. No, wait, I need to go. Thank God I'm almost done. Partners. I think there's 35 on this slide. Size of logo does not indicate importance. It's me trying to slam 35 logos in a small space. But, from, again, other countries, development organizations, local partners, local NGOs, regional organizations, they are what allowed us to make the progress we did in the last 3 years. And so thank you to all of them, and again to State Department and USAID for their support. And I think that from the NOAA perspective, we're primarily a domestic agency, and that's our focus. But our products and our services have the potential for global application and impact. And so this type of partnership where we can match NOAA technical experience and expertise with an entity such as USAID, who does have the mandate to work internationally, is just a real win-win, in our minds for everybody, because we find that when we do go out and we are working with partners on issues such as building climate services, we learn as much from them and from this experience and from setting up this process as they do from us. So the partnerships are huge. And I'll stop there and say thank you. And there's contact information for myself here in the DC area, as well as John Marra, who again is in Honolulu and hopefully still on the phone. And I'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Britt. That was great. We'll have questions, but I just wanted to say that this is cool. I feel like this last 6 months or a year of these meetings, we've been seeing more about things that are actually being done and that are working. And when we started doing this series 3 or 4 years ago, the hope was that that was very dramatic.
You know what it is?
that we would see things that were working in one place, and by having a diverse group like this in the room, people could take something working
Let me stand back
and
too.
apply it somewhere else. There's stuff that I've seen in this that we could apply to work we've been doing in the Caribbean. I think there's stuff that we've been doing with IRI, which is not exactly NOAA, but certainly affiliated.
Close, yep.
Would exist without NOAA, and vice versa. And so I look forward to looking through the El Nino handbook and something else that I found on my phone. The website works. The stories. So this is, I feel like I'm excited. We're getting to where we wanted to be 4 years ago. There's stuff to actually share. I also wanted to say thank you to the Atlas team for hosting this. I always forget to do that, and I will. You want me to turn off the mic?
It doesn't matter. You can. Might be better to get it away from this one.
So, questions?
Should I try to turn it on? Should I try, or just wait? We can wait.
If you could, please, even though you have the mic, speak up so the webinar mic picks it up.
Only her mic works for the webinar.
Yeah.
I can repeat too. If
Or you
Okay.
can speak, yeah.
All right, I'm Dan Martin, affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Spent a good deal of time in earlier lives in this part of the world. I have two questions. One is whether NOAA and other federal agencies can relate differently, or does relate differently, to the three compact states in Micronesia because of their formal connection with the United States. And the other question is, what on earth can you actually do when the pH and temperature of the ocean changes?
Great. So, two questions. Does the U.S. relate differently to the compact states versus the other Pacific Islands? And then a question about what can you do when pH drops and temperature rise. I'm assuming you're talking about in correlation to coral reefs. I don't think John's going to be able to. That's fine. So first of all, and there may be folks in the room who can answer this question with more depth, but yes, I think the United States does relate differently to the compact states, the freely associated states, in that we actually do have closer relationships with them, agreements like treaties, et cetera. So I think that we probably, depending on the agency, have more programs of work in those places. So my program specifically has grant opportunities for the countries in Micronesia. So yeah, does that answer your question? I think there are differences in how we relate.
And then aid is generally not supposed to work in states because it's like working in Florida. I had a project in the Marshall Islands a few years ago that was funded by state, and the state project implemented by aid. EMO works there, although I think right now we have somebody from, the Emergency Management Agency, I believe, supports compact states. I think our AIDS Office for Disaster Assistance is there right now, and I've lost track of who's sort of right now. But generally, aid does not work there, but we do work in other states where
and as far as pH and temperature, the conditions right now around coral reefs and the stresses that they experience, so there's not much you can do to stop the pH from dropping and the temperatures from rising, right? But what we are working with managers, both domestic and internationally, is the concept of resilience-based management. And so this is, same, it's ecosystem-based management. It's all the things that they're doing. It's managing what happens on land to help improve health in the water. But it's really focused on knowing what's coming with the climate change impact, doing our very best to take care of all of the other things that are impacting our coral reefs such that they are the healthiest they can be, hoping that some can survive what is coming until we regain control of our emissions. And then there are some experiments on a very small scale of doing things to try to mitigate, if you will, the thermal stress, the temperature stress during a bleaching event. So some breaking up of the water surface, because it's really the light, actually, during the high stress, high temperature events that's causing coral bleaching and some of the stress. So, you know, are there things you can do on a local scale at a really, really important reef to help it cope with that and perhaps lessen the impact of that event? Small scale does not work across large expansive reef. So yeah, there's, I mean, sadly the outlook for reefs right now is pretty dire, especially given this global bleaching event.
I'm going to try to balance it.
Hi, Loretta Burke, World Resources Institute.
Hi.
I was curious about the warning system and what sort of thresholds they arrived at. How it differs from NOAA's hotspot
Yep.
or
Yep.
sort of indicator?
Yep. So the question is, how does the early warning system for coral reefs in Vanuatu and the thresholds associated with it differ from NOAA's Coral Reef Watch? And the answer is it doesn't. We actually took Coral Reef Watch with us. And what we ended up doing is, as I said, so the NOAA products would have one virtual station for Vanuatu. They wanted to increase that resolution, in essence, have more. And so that was the first step we did after the first dialogue. The second step was then to go in and teach them how to actually pull down all of the Coral Reef Watch data and make it theirs. And we also talked a lot with them about that those thresholds are really good guesses, but that local conditions could also raise or lower those thresholds of bleaching, and so that they should consider that and consider changing the thresholds for the different sites if they find over time that our thresholds are not quite accurate.
Thank you. My name is Deborah Brosnan, and I have a question for you on capacity and size, something you touched on a little bit. Most of my familiarity is with the Caribbean area, and we just came back from teaching a course on building capacity with the 11 OECS nations. And there you have many of these areas are really small. I mean, they're very large rocks, some of them. And you may have one person in charge of climate change and fisheries with a lot of interest, and they've done a lot of courses, but they're quite isolated. And so the capacity of the individual islands is quite small. There are challenges of getting them to work together.
Yep.
And I just wondered, just to get some of your insights and comments on the sort of the span you saw in capacity and size and how you dealt with it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Can folks hear on the phone, or should I try to repeat? Okay, great. Okay. So the point of the question was some of the differences in capacity of the different places, both staff and ability to, I think, take in some of this information and use it. So it runs the gamut. I think, as I said, Vanuatu, I mean, they have their own climate services division within the meteorological and geohazards division, or office within the division. That's not, I think that's becoming more common, that you have dedicated staff to, for instance, climate services or climate information, but I don't think it's definitely not a given. And you're right, I think in some places people wear many different hats and have a lot of responsibilities, and they get training on so many different aspects of that. I mean, attending a lot of these meetings in the Pacific, especially, but in the Caribbean as well, you see the same people, like, again and again and again, which is good in some ways, but you're like, when do you ever get to, like, actually use what you learn? Because you're always the point person being sent out, you know, to all of these different trainings and opportunities. And so I think it differs greatly, and I think that there's also something that you said about the isolation, and you learn this stuff, but then you go back and you have no one to talk to, you have no one to interact with. And so an example from the Pacific that has worked in Micronesia is they've set up a community of practice. And so there's folks from, you know, the natural resource management agencies and the fisheries agencies, and those types of folks who end up working together a lot, and they've now set up kind of a community of practice where there's opportunities at different intervals for them to get together, to interact, to do things together, to try to put together plans, you know, for marine protected areas, for fisheries enforcement issues, to compare notes and to have more of a regional approach, if you will, so that they aren't so alone. So I think that sort of approach can work. And then, you know, even in the case of the Met Service in Vanuatu, one of kind of the outcomes that they took on was to consider how their office is staffed, and do they need to, you know, think about a different division of duties in order to meet some of the goals they've put for themselves, you know, on climate services. So I don't know if that really answers your question, except to say that same problems and, you know, different solutions being tried in different places, but it's definitely an issue, and it does run the gamut. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Kristen Clay from the Nature Conservancy. Thank you for the presentation. And I was curious, it's a great example of Vanuatu being able to take up this information with good indication of sustainability going forward. You referenced that in other cases the baton might be passed to a regional organization. Do you have an example yet of either that happening, or can you talk a little bit about the organizations that you are hoping will take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the example that I have that's kind of in process right now, and I'm probably going to get, let's see if I wrote it down. Yes. So Australia had a program called the Climate and Ocean Support Program in the Pacific. Very large program, again, focused a lot on these same issues of data and information, climate-related data and information, get it to the countries in a way that, you know, that they can use it. And they set up that program, and it went for many years, but funding is going away, and they don't want the program to go away and the work they've done. And so they're actually, I think, and for some reason I have both entities written down, and I don't think that's right, but they're actually looking at institutionalizing a lot of the components of that program into, I think, SPREP. I have both SPREP and SPC written down, but I think it's SPREP. So there is precedence for, you know, these kind of putting something together, putting a program, a framework for delivering information together, and then transferring it to one of these regional organizations who do have the capacity, you know, to do it. But I think what that would take to do it successfully for something like climate services is a lead up where you're working with all of those countries who don't have the capacity themselves to truly understand their needs, putting a framework together to deliver on those needs, and then, you know, transferring it, working with something like a regional organization through each step of the way, so that it's a full partnership from moment one, with the plan to hand it off in, you know, X number of years, 4 or 6 years, whatever it takes. But I think that could work for those places like Kiribati, like, you know, others that just have very little capacity within, you know, the meteorological services or other entities within the country to do the work. We haven't talked to them about SPREP. I mean, we've partnered with SPREP on all of this. We haven't, you know, so these are just ideas, but I think it could be doable.
I have a few questions from people here online, and then we'll get back to the room. The first one is, since NOAA is also doing fantastic work in Indonesia, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, are there some bigger picture lessons you're learning across all of this work?
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I think probably a lot of the lessons learned have the same flavor, just slightly different words than a lot of what I've talked about today. You know, I guess another one that I kind of alluded to but didn't hit on is so much of our success in place, and this applies to our work domestically as well, honestly, hinges on a key person or a couple key people. And so there's that issue too with, you know, you're doing great work because there's someone on the ground who is with you and believes in it and is a champion for it, and then they take another job and they're gone and there's not the capacity. I mean, we work with, you know, that issue of turnover all the time. And so, you know, one of the things that we've, I think, learned from some work we've done across Southeast Asia and elsewhere with some of our MPA, Marine Protected Area Management Capacity Building, is actually trying to hone in on, like, what does it take to be the kind of leader and manager who is able to kind of gather the force behind you to get some of this work done, and can you train that? Like, can you, I mean, some of that is innate, you know, in people, but can you actually, you know, think about some of those qualities of leadership and of working with people, and can you train that in addition to, you know, how you manage an MPA? Like, how do you manage people? How do you facilitate processes like this? So, but I think a lot of it, you know, are probably very similar to the lessons learned here. And I think there's still a lot we could learn from each other in the programs that we even work with, you know, across our agency and others. So.
I'm Ari Gershman with UCAR.
Mm-hmm.
So early on you mentioned that a lot of their climate services needs were mostly around things having to do with natural variability, not as much around anthropogenic variability. Is that fair?
No, I would say what they wanted to focus on first was the issues of natural variability overlaid with the anthropogenic. That was just, so it was that we can't do it all. We really want to focus on how El Nino is going to impact us, because we know it is, and can you help us, because in the past it's been devastating to, you know, for drought, for the marine ecosystem, for fisheries, you know, so it's not to say that the other is not extremely important and something they're feeling and dealing with now. It was just we couldn't do everything, and that was where they asked us to focus.
And so when talking about, all right then, when talking about natural variability on top of anthropogenic variability, was there conversation then around the fact that you might know what's coming in terms of El Nino or La Nina, but it's going to manifest in ways that are not traditional and are not familiar?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how those conversations went?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any specifically, but I think that, you know, through the climate stories, through that process, you know, there was a lot of, you know, this is what we used to experience during some of these events, and now it's, you know, so much worse. I think one, it may be too complicated to get John, you know, speaking through the speaker to talk about it. He knows more than I, but another one is just like, you know, things like king tides and inundation in places like the Marshall Islands and Micronesia. You know, they've always had king tides and inundation events, but not with the frequency that they're having them now. And so it's those sorts of, especially when you're sitting around and kind of talking story about what's going on and what people are experiencing, that those sorts of things come out. And, you know, the other thing that we did, I didn't go into detail, but one of the processes or activities we went through was a historical timeline generation in each of these places, and some of them were fascinating to see, you know, so we started with what's the earliest memory in the room, or grandpa's memory that grandpa shared with you of, you know, an impact to whatever sector, and just to, you know, to see on the timeline the increasing frequency of those events, and to have that conversation about, you know, what's normal and what is no longer normal, and yeah. So it did come out, absolutely.
Thanks. I have a few more from online. One is from a former Peace Corps volunteer in Vanuatu. Do you think there could be any role for Peace Corps volunteers on outer islands to work on global climate change related data gathering, training, and information dissemination, particularly since the government and other officials and NGO reps tend to be clustered in the urban areas? Yeah,
so they hear it, good. Yes, absolutely, and it's very interesting because one of our core team members for the work in Vanuatu is a former Vanuatu Peace Corps volunteer as well. And we did talk a lot about the role of, you know, that sort of resource in these countries, and we haven't really followed up necessarily on that aspect of the work, but I think absolutely there could be roles. And because the other thing that we talk a lot about is kind of the role of citizen science in helping to map the impacts and to validate some of the climate products and services. And so that's another place where, you know, having that sort of presence on the ground that could help set up, you know, in Vanuatu they already have, kind of a rainfall network. And we were talking a lot about how you could add to that and how that information could feed back into some of the stuff we're working on now.
Great, I'll have one more here and then we'll go back to the room. This is a participant from the Federated States of Micronesia. I'm just wondering if there's any upcoming projects regarding climate change that you're going to do in the Micronesian islands?
So yes, I can't speak to specifics, but I know that there's a lot of recent work that's been funded through Department of Insular Affairs at DOI, Department of the Interior, to work in Micronesia on some climate change and coral reef issues. Our program at NOAA has some ongoing work in that region on climate and adaptation. And if they email me, I'm happy to connect some dots and see what they're interested in.
Yeah, so my name is Prabs, and I'm from Marra Energy. So I'm curious to know, does isolation from the mainland, as in the U.S. mainland, does that contribute to problems in climate change? Because if you look at it, there's been a lot of problems with Puerto Rico's corrupt system, or even Hawaii. Doesn't isolation play a very big part? Also, plus the culture, because if you look at Hawaii, has a lot of Asians, and Puerto Rico has more Hispanics. Do you think that can be affecting very well?
So the question was, does isolation with the location of some of these islands affect kind of climate change impacts and approach to dealing with them? And I think yes, but in the ways we were talking about with some of the questions from the room, you're isolated. Access to water during drought is a huge logistical problem. I think there's the isolation can contribute to just your ability to interact with other people who are dealing with the same problem. We have all this technology now, but there's nothing like sitting down and talking to someone and working with someone. So, I think that absolutely, when you're a small island, isolation is one of the challenges you face. If you're on the continental United States, there's a different set of challenges. Yep.
Shirley Buzzard with the Brace Institute, and we provide financial and technical assistance to communities that have to relocate because of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered if the fact that so many of the islanders are going to have to move has figured into your work.
So the question is, has the potential issue of relocation factored into our work for working with the Pacific Islanders? And I would say that it is an issue that we are very aware of, but given some of the focus of the work we're doing, it has not been part of the work, and it's not at the forefront of the conversation, though always there.
Thank you very much, Britt. This has really been very good. Chris Greenon with the Atlas Project. And just a question about the dashboards, which I think are really a great potential product and something, the way you described it, I haven't seen before. And I can see lots of country-specific applications by sector pretty much everywhere in the world.
Yep.
So I wondered, is that something is that like a package that NOAA has created, and that would be relatively easy under USAID projects, for example, for us to roll out in other countries?
So the challenge with the dashboard system is that you need to, the question was, for those on the phone, the question was, is the dashboard is seen as something that could be very useful for multiple sectors in multiple places, and is that a package that NOAA could kind of hand off for use and application in other places? So yes and no, currently. So I think we certainly, we have examples of fully fleshed out dashboards. NOAA's Coral Reef Watch is one of them. So if you go to the website, you can look at all the maps and all that, but the bottom line is if you look at your country, there is a gauge that tells you what the bleaching level alert is, and the outlook show you the 1 month, 2 month, and 3 month outlook for whether that gauge is dropping back down to no stress or the stress is building. The challenge with the dashboard is that you need to know the thresholds. There have to be defined thresholds. And so for every indicator, for every application, you have to go through that process. And so we started that process in Vanuatu for the nearshore pelagic fisheries because we had scientists in the room who were like, well, there's scientific data out there that say at this temperature, in this temperature range, you'll see more skipjack, and at this temperature range, you'll see this, and at that, and so that's the first step, right, is what's the science? But then each place is different, and there's local, so there's this whole process one would have to go through to get to the point where you have a meaningful dashboard. And so it's something that we've thought a lot about, and yes, we could do it, but it would just take that investment of time and effort over a period of time to put in place something that is meaningful. But the process for doing that, I think, is relatively straightforward in the framework for doing that. It's just you'd have to go through that process.
Yeah, just quickly to follow. I was thinking like in the ag sector, one of the things that we're doing for it is doing these sort of quick and dirty climate risk assessments by country. And in the ag sector in particular, there are thresholds for heat for certain crops and things, and those are pretty well understood scientifically. And this kind of thing could be really useful in terms of showing where the balance tips and what ought to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I would say, let's talk and talk more because, the other place I think it's been used somewhat successfully is also the health sector with things like mosquito-borne diseases and the impacts of rainfall and temperature and putting all that information together to say something about risk of, certain mosquito-borne diseases. There's a lot, and like you said, for an application like you've described, where a lot of those thresholds are pretty well defined, it could be pretty straightforward. You'd still have to go through a test phase, but.
Hi, Kristen Dreiling from Monty's Environment and Natural Resources team. Thank you again for your presentation. So my question gets back to kind of and also then the sustainability of approaches like this. And just kind of, I was wondering if you could talk to, I think in the specific or in a smaller and developed state context is specific, but I think it applies elsewhere. But if you could speak to kind of what was your impression of the absorption capacity of the limited staff and capacity to actually take all of these on board and sustainably continue to utilize these tools going forward, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges.
Absolutely. So the question was on kind of the coordination among partners and the sustainability of this sort of process and work and the absorptive, I can't say that word, capacity of the staff on the ground to kind of take it up. And again, I think that varies from place to place quite significantly. But I think we increase the chances of that if closely related projects from different sources are working together, such that when we leave and the Kiwis come in next week, which is what is happening, we've actually worked closely with them, and they wanted to be there when we were there, but they couldn't, but they're doing a lot of the same thing, different sector, slightly different application, and what the Met Service was really excited about was they saw the ability to take what we'd talked about and what they'd learned during the week with us and kind of translated a bit, adapted a bit to also help them with what they were going to do with the New Zealanders, next week. And so I think the more that we can, and it's hard, like there's so much going on, there's so much, but the more we can coordinate and align and make things complementary, the closer we'll get. But again, that's really, really difficult, and it takes people, it's the people who are willing to work together. And but yeah, it's a hard one. It's really tough, and I think that in some places, just the exposure to some of the information that was out there has led them to now use that information in some way, and like that was the win there. In Vanuatu, that win looks very different. But yeah, I don't know if that's really answered your question, but if we could answer that question, we would all of a sudden like really advance the work we're trying to do very quickly.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Sasha Gottlieb from the U.S. Forest Service, and I was wondering how much you all got into, or others are getting into, the land side of things. And you were talking about the management for resiliency and the impact of land management on forests.
Yep. So in this project, so the question was how much we'd gotten into kind of the land-based management process. And I would say that in this project, it would depend on what the topic was. So, and I can't speak to it because I wasn't actually part of it, but I think that in the Marshall Islands, talking drought and water resource management and inundation, they talked a bit more about, some of the land-based processes. We talked about it in Vanuatu from the perspective of the ENZO handbook and the actions they might want to take at different times when there's high stress on their reefs. So, and thinking about more proactive decision making that involves stopping deforestation, reforestation efforts, things like that. So in this project, somewhat, I think. My program, the coral program, for instance, every day, like land-based sources of pollution and partnerships with USDA are key to our domestic work. But internationally with this, because we weren't focusing so much on management of reefs specifically.
Yes. Everybody online? Thanks, everybody. Please stick around and have cookies and soft drinks or whatever, and talk with each other. Thank you, Britt. This was great. Thank you, Atlas, for hosting us.